Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Before we start today, I'm excited to share some news about the podcast with you. I've really been thinking about how we can continue to support each other in our queer communities more. So I'm asking each guest to name a nonprofit of their choice, and I will make a donation in their name. But that's not all. This podcast has been a labor of love, and I don't want to sell advertising on the show because I don't want to get distracted from the important conversations we have here. I want to support our communities, and this is where you come in. I have set up a Patreon account at patreon.com/queer spirit. There are 4 levels of patronage to choose from, which offer gratitude gifts such as thank you shoutouts on the show, a sticker or enamel button with the Queer Spirit logo, and access to a live monthly meditation group. All Patreon funds remaining after the basic production costs will be added to the nonprofit donations. So go to patreon.com/queer spirit and help me to support our queer communities. Today, my guest is Roger Kuhn. Roger is a doctoral candidate whose research focuses on two-spirit love, sexual sovereignty, and erotic survivance. He works as a psychotherapist and professor of American Indian Studies and is a board member of the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits, also known as BAAITS. In 2020, Roger served as the chair for the BAAITS Two-Spirit Powwow. In our conversation, Roger shares his passions about decolonizing sexuality, two-spirit love, and erotic survivance. We unpack what it means as queer folks to unsettle our bodies from cis straight culture, liberate our Eros, and respectfully reconnect with indigenous land. Learn more about him at rogerjkuhn.com. That's ROGERJKUHN.com. Hi, Roger. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Roger, you do quite a few different things. You're into psychology and sex therapy, and you dance, and you also are very involved in the Native American and indigenous peoples community. And I wanted to start out by having you share with us how you got interested in somatic work and sex therapy.
Sure. Well, hence, Jay, welcome everyone. Thanks for the time this afternoon. I'm coming to you this morning from Pomo territory up in Guerneville, California. So, I always think that I took my first yoga class in 1999. And to be very transparent, I loved and still do the album Ray of Light, Madonna. And she had this article in Vanity Fair about yoga. And I was like, well, shoot, if Madonna's doing yoga, I should probably get myself to a class. And I did. What I was not anticipating in that class was the physical and emotional release I was going to experience. I remember getting into Kapotasana pigeon pose, and I remember a tear rolling down my cheek, just like, whoa, where did that come from? Then I left class just thinking like something shifted in my body. And when I really thought about what does that part of my body mean to me, what does it signify, I wept. Because I have some trauma there from childhood, something that I witnessed. And then I just recognized like there's something about my body and my emotional world that no one had ever connected for me before, and I didn't quite understand. So I began to spin my inquiry into yoga practice. I started to practice the 5 rhythms, Gabrielle Roth's work. It was all when I was still living in New York City. I got involved in meditation and mindfulness practices. And then eventually, I went to massage school. I went and studied yoga and became a yoga teacher. And I was noticing things about my own experiences that were also resonant with clients, that massage clients or yoga clients, that they were having these emotional releases. And they would want to talk to me about them. And I thought, well, I'm not really qualified to do that, but I would love to talk to you about that. I'd love to talk to you about what's happening. Let me go and study some more. And I'll come back and we'll talk about this again sometime in the future. And that's really how I got into it, just really recognizing my own body's need for release and how that impacted my emotional world, and really how I then might be able to offer that same experience to people through what we now refer to as somatic psychology.
And for those listeners who don't really know what somatic psychology is, can you help us understand a little bit more about that?
Sure. So soma, in its most stripped down basic definition, means the body. And I consider myself a soma cultural psychotherapist, which means that I'm interested in the body and the way that culture shapes and informs how we understand our lives. So somatic psychotherapists have varying different ideologies when it comes to body psychotherapy. And mine, as I say, that soma cultural approach. But, this is largely the work. The field is somewhat largely known for theory and Western philosophers. And somatics itself is rooted in ideologies from all over the world, from indigenous ideologies to Asian ideologies, African ideologies, and Euro tradition show up in the somatic world. It just largely is viewed from this Eurocentric lens, which is why I bring in the cultural aspect to it. I think we need to talk about culture and how that impacts the body as much as we need to talk about these heady theories that talk about the body.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little bit about what somatics is and how I view that particular work.
Mm-hmm. So talking about bringing culture into the body and into somatic therapy, I know that you're currently working on your Ph.D. dissertation, and one of the topics that you're bringing into that is decolonizing sexuality.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could share more about what that means and how you are writing about that, how you're bringing that into your work with your clients.
Yeah, it's writing a dissertation is one of the most boring / challenging / exciting things I've ever done. And I've learned so much about myself through the process and really questioning, what does it mean to decolonize, just to start with. And, I've recently been learning a lot from what's been going on with the racial and social issues impacting our country right now. And I'm now of the mind that decolonizing sexuality is for me, for Two-Spirit folk, and for other indigenous peoples. For non-indigenous people, y'all need to unsettle sexuality. As settlers to this land, it's different. And I think that decolonial process is really for indigenous folks. And I didn't really quite grasp that prior. I was more in this way of no, we decolonize. And I was thinking about we decolonize our syllabus and our work, our therapy. And I was including this collective we and recognizing that wasn't really true, because how can folks who are non-indigenous actually decolonize when decolonization is about the land? We always have to start with the land when we're talking about decolonization. And for me, to decolonize sexuality means to recognize that prior to invasion or prior to settler nation, which we now have, we had a robust understanding of sexuality, including gender and orientation, on the land that we now call America or the United States or Canada. And so to decolonize sexuality for me as an indigenous person is to accept the truth of my multi-gender identity and the fluidity of my sexual orientation. It is to rid myself of the capital G gay label that I had held for so many years and just go back to lowercase g gay, because I feel that that's more inclusive, because capital G gay, as I've also learned recently, speaks more to a white gay experience, which I've never fully had in my own life. Although I am mixed, I have a white father, but I've never experienced, say, the larger sort of white-centric gay world. So decolonizing sexuality really is about that for me. It's a personal journey that ties directly to my indigeneity, and how that translates professionally from a professor perspective or from a therapist perspective is just in that. I am a sex therapist, so when clients come to me and they're struggling with erectile issues, ejaculatory issues, and they struggle with these tropes of masculinity, I know something different. I know my culture teaches me something different about gender. And I can bring that through my decolonial lens. I can help them unsettle a little bit. And I want to make it real clear to anyone that's listening today that, the decolonial process, decolonizing sexuality, is not about this reclamation of give me back. It's about honor space, please. Right? That's really what it is for me. It's I'm never going to get my land back. I know that. Y'all would kill us first before that would happen. And so can you please honor our truth as a people of what our tradition, what our values were prior to invasion?
What I think about when I hear you speak about that is, for all queer people, no matter what our ethnic or cultural background is that there's this way in which we may need to start with ourselves and just our own body first, in the way that our bodies may have been not colonized, but sort of the way that our sexuality has been erased or made invisible in the larger culture, that then we don't feel like we are in our body, and that maybe our body may have been, in some way of looking at it, colonized by the larger straight white culture in the country, and that we need to maybe, especially for white people, to start with that and then move, once we can do that with ourselves, to be able to move out from there into, our other queer brothers and sisters, on this land, and then move on to the earth and to the land in that way, to be able to, it will feel easier, I imagine, to do that with community and with the land once we do that with ourselves.
That's right. The queer eroticism, in terms of our queer eco-eroticism, I think is so incredibly powerful, right? And so I would ask anybody, same question that I ask myself quite often is, what is my relationship to the land that I'm on? I mentioned at the top of our conversation today, I'm in Pomo territory right now. And anybody that's listening can figure out what territory they are on. There's a great app called Native Land. If you Google Native Land, I think it's nativeland.ca. It's a Canadian group. There's a website, but also you can download it off of the iTunes or the Google Play Store. And it's a GPS located sort of device that you could type in like a zip code or a city, and it will bring up what's the tribal territory that you're on. There's a link then that you can learn more about that. So, I just wonder that, anytime I hear land acknowledgements happening, which are real popular right now, I always want to go like, what are you as an organization doing for those people? What are you doing? If you're just getting up there and giving lip service, that ain't doing nothing. That's for you. That is for you. That is to heal whatever fragile little world you're in right now. Try to make yourself feel better. But if you ain't giving back, if you ain't giving a percentage of those door sales to the people of that land, go check yourself, please. I'm not here for your land acknowledgement. Just personally, I just sort of feel like being indigenous is political. Our existence is inherently political. We're the only group in what we now call the United States that has to prove, that we are of this group. Otherwise, the government doesn't include us in anything. So I think that's really important. That's why for us, land is so important. If I didn't have my reservation back home, if I didn't know where my people were from, you feel lost. You can feel lost. I noticed that so much of my own white culture, like my family, their European blood is from like Germany, and they consider themselves Germans. But yet I didn't really grow up with a lot of like German, I don't really know like German culture very well. I know like American German culture, but when I went to Germany, I was like, it's cute and all, but I don't resonate with this stuff. And I think a lot of like white folk in America are that way. Like and this is to say too, Nick, about like when you were mentioning queer folk, like what is it about queer assimilation? How have we as queer folk assimilated our gender, assimilated our orientation to these larger Western heterocentric values you were speaking of a moment ago? I think we've done that, and largely it's the same reason why indigenous folks did it too, because we had to survive. So let me assimilate so you don't kill me. And that's the same about our queer relatives, whether they're indigenous or not. Let us assimilate so you don't kill us. Why are we as a culture so obsessed with this idea of passing, whether you're passing as straight or you're passing as real? I'm putting that in quotes for those that can't see that. Why are we so obsessed with that? That's an assimilation factor. And that's largely about survival. And it's important to have those conversations as a community about choices that we've made for our survival that might be based upon colonial ideology or attempted genocide, right? It's all rooted in that for me personally. That's the lens in which I see that. And then, of course, it shows up clinically for me, how I view the work.
So I want to just pause here and make a plug for myself or refer back to a previous episode for anyone listening to this now who didn't catch the first episode of this season, where I actually interviewed Canyon Sayers Roods, Coyote Woman, and we talked a lot about the land recognition. And so if people want to hear more about that conversation, to go back and listen to that. And I'll recopy the show notes from that has the link to that app where people can check that out. And also a few sites where people could pay their land tax if they want to do that. Gosh, you just said a couple things that I want to circle back to. But one of them was you talked about survival, which I think is really important. And I also saw that another part of your dissertation is on erotic survivance. And I'd actually never heard the word survivance before and looked it up. So I wonder if you could share with us a little bit more about that.
The word survivance comes from the work of Gerald Visenor, who talks about the importance of the narrative. So this is why I think this should real vibe with therapists. It's very similar to like a narrative therapy approach. Survivance is really the story, and whether it's an individual or a community or a collective story of a resistance and survival. And so when I think of erotic survivance, I think of, from a two-spirit perspective, of course I'm resisting. I am resisting hetero-patriarchal ideology. That is my primary reason I'm alive, I think, is to resist these things. And I've survived. And my sexuality has survived, and it's thriving, right? And I think that my research shows that, two-spirit folk love, they fuck, they have orgies, they do all those things that other queer folks do as well. And those are our stories, and when I think of like my two-spirit kin, my two-spirit relatives, when we get together and, we gossip and we talk about boys and girls and trans folks and people that we're attracted to. And it's the joy that comes from that, just like kicking back with your friends, talking about this stuff. It's really healing. Pleasure heals. Stella Resnick, who is another sex therapist that I really admire, she has this little button that she passes out. It says pleasure heals. And I think that to me is like erotic survivance is pleasure. It's healing. It's using the narrative, your narrative, my narrative, to heal ourselves. And I know that by that process, my own process of decolonization, my own process of unsettling, because I have to do both, brings me closer to my erotic survivance. And through my freeing of my narrative, I hope to help folks like you or like my clients or like anybody else who is somewhat rewriting, relearning, remembering, whatever it might be, their own erotic story of resistance and survival, especially as queer folk. I think that, and Eros, is so important I could not do my dissertation work without having to steep into Western ideology. It's just a part of the academia, the academy, if you will. So, I looked at like, well, where does Eros come from? Who was talking about Eros back in the day? And really recognizing that like, well, if we strip it back to its most pure form, at least to really hyper generalize here, it's about love. And love is, spirit giving us this gift to love each other. That's what I've really discovered so much about this process is that the erotic holds so much. And when we fail to process the erotic, it becomes eroticized. And I feel like that's what we do so much as a culture is we eroticize, hypersexualize everything. So like even like a beauty of like, you're a beautiful man, Nick. Can you just be a beautiful man? Can I admire you for your beauty instead of having to sexualize that beauty? I want to be erotic with you. I don't need to eroticize you, and that's something I think can be really healing for a lot of folks is to recognize like be in the erotic, be in that erotic survivance with yourself, to rewrite your narrative, to learn something new about yourself that can heal. Pleasure heals.
Yeah, I mean, the way that you're talking about what I sort of am feeling as you talk about that is like when you are quote unquote eroticize something, it's almost like this removal of connection, this objectification, which is also kind of what I think the way that Westerners have objectified the earth in a way, and the way that we think about that as the land, which can also help with the decolonizing of the land and decolonizing of our bodies. And I'm really getting excited just hearing you talk about that. And I feel like I'm getting your dissertation on so many different levels in the way that you're bringing these pieces in.
I'm glad one of us is, because I'm still, what am I doing? I've got about 74 pages at the moment that, some of the writing, I'm like, wow, great job. And others, I'm like, what is this? So it's all unfolding. And I'm actually in the process right now of looking at my research, reviewing my transcripts to really see what, these questions that I posed, what is the thread there that's connecting these individuals? And so much of that is based on a Muskoke word, anokajigo, which in my Muskoke language is the word that we use for love. And it doesn't mean like, I love you, like in the romantic way, but it means like, I love you because you're my family, because you're my community, because you're my And the big thing for me around that is like where I experience that most is at the powwow. When I'm at the BAAITS Two-Spirit Powwow, for the first time in my life, when now I know what Anogachigo is. This for me is what this is. This love of these people, of this community, of this strength, of this erotic survivance is exactly what that word means to me. So my dissertation is at the moment titled Anogachigo, Two-Spirit Love, Sexual Sovereignty, and Erotic Survivance is my working title at the moment of my dissertation, which I hope to turn into a book called Two-Spirit Love Is, where I sort of take my chapters and say, Two-Spirit Love is, and then I go a little bit more about what the informants were saying and deepen sort of the discourse around that.
Now, I wonder if you can give your definition of Two-Spirit, because when I had Canyon on, she gave hers, and I'm wondering if you can give your definition of yours, and also if you can help us understand how it's similar and how it's different from gay or queer.
Sure. Well, I have both a personal and a professional answer because I teach a class called Native Sexuality and Queer Discourse. And this is a big part of what we talk about. What is Two-Spirit? And so I have the students watch all kinds of videos of individuals talking about what it means to them to be Two-Spirit. And I know that from a historical perspective, this word came about because of resistance. This word came about because of what Wisner called survivance, what I'm now calling erotic survivance, because folks were pushing back on Western terminology that largely anthropologists were using to describe Native folk. I don't need to repeat that word for you all today. So Two-Spirit came in existence to say, no, you're not going to do that to us. We are going to recontrol our narrative, which has to do with our gender. And so Two-Spirit when it came about, was really speaking about Native gender. And then as it's morphed into how we're using it today, how I use the term is more of an umbrella term to talk about my gender fluidity and my orientation fluidity. It's both. I don't really separate the two in that way. I just know that personally, when I came across that word, I remember feeling somatically in my body this sense of, I belong. I've never felt that I belonged. And now there's a word for me that I resonate with, actually, and it feels good. And I learned about it not from white folk. I learned about it from other people that identify as Two-Spirit. My friend Patrick said to me, "Oh, you're like me, you're Two-Spirit." And I went, "What is that?" This is also when I was living in New York. And I just remember that moment just deeply opening up who I was, and it changed who I am. And that's largely why I'm having this conversation with you today. That conversation many moons ago. And I think it's still evolving. There's a term that folks are using now called indigiqueer, which I think is cute and I like, and I feel like an indigiqueer as well. And some folks are using that more, this reclamation, like, well, Two-Spirit doesn't really vibe with them for whatever reason. I still like Two-Spirit. I call myself a Two-Spirit indigiqueer. And, really owning a queer label has really made me step more away from the term gay. Just, again, because I associate so much of gayness with a lifestyle that I don't have, or that I've been largely excluded from, or have felt largely excluded from. And queer just makes more sense to me. And Two-Spirit makes the most sense to me about who I am, honoring both sides, all sides of me.
Yeah. I get that. I think that a lot of younger queer folk, who are white Euromutts, basically, shall we say, are also stepping away from the gay label. I think that it predominantly gets attached to white cisgendered men in that way. And I think that, younger folk are really tuning into that. And I also really like that, because to me, it also feels more inclusive.
Yeah.
In terms of gender identity and sexuality and, whatever people want to throw under that. So that's why I like that label and prefer that word.
One more important thing that I left out in terms of defining Two-Spirit, that Two-Spirit is an addition, not a replacement, for indigenous languages which already have a term for gender fluidity or sexual orientation fluidity. It's very important to sort of recognize that Two-Spirit isn't used by all indigenous folks. Some folks actually, in their world, Two-Spirit, it would be someone that is having mental health issues.
Oh.
So they don't use that term Two-Spirit. They would use their traditional language to define that. And I'm for that. I always think if you know the language, use it if you can.
Mm-hmm.
And that is largely, one of the challenges of colonization is that indigenous language have been erased somewhat. Not all of them, but a lot of them have been deeply impacted by that. And we've lost those terms for gender sexual orientation variants.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably true of a lot of other cultures and languages around the world, that they did have a word for that, except that word was lost or went underground.
That's right.
And now when you hear people speaking that language, they'll just quickly, reference the English word gay or lesbian or, any other derogatory word they want to use for that if it's a slur in that way, instead of using their own indigenous word that maybe meant that felt more honoring and respectful in that way. So Roger, I wonder if you can share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish.
I wrote a chapter in this book called Diverse Bodies, Diverse Practices. And in that chapter, I express how my life was transformed through the work of Gabrielle Roth's 5 Rhythms. I stumbled into a 5 Rhythms class 20-something years ago in New York City. A friend had told me about it. And I remember meeting with, even from my first interaction at the desk, checking in, I thought, wow, you're real sweet. You're a real nice person. And then I stepped into the room and there was low lighting and candles, and there was some, what sounded like Middle Eastern style music playing. And I thought, oh, this is going to be fun. 2 hours later, I leave drenched in sweat with just my heart open so wide. I've always considered myself a dancer. And so I finally feel as if I had found this thing that allowed me to deepen my connection to what I think is spirit, but also deepen my connection to myself. And I've been dancing the rhythms now for, like I said, about 20 years off and on. So I have always found personally that dance, in particular dance that's more free form, more ecstatic style type dance, is very spiritual for me, as is art, as is writing music, playing music, singing is one of the most transformative things that I can do. My husband was out for a run this morning, and boy, did I have a shower concert that was so good. I mean, I was like, oh, this should have been recorded today. It was just boom, no one was around. I could sing as loud as I wanted to. And I felt so close to spirit in that moment, And, since I've been home, one of the things that I've been doing prior to my therapy sessions is using sage more, which I did not do very often in my office because my office was small. And sometimes sage, for folks that aren't used to smelling sage, it can be a lot for them. So oftentimes I never burned it in my office. And now I'm using sage again to really feel connected, centered, and grounded before I do this work. And it has really transformed how I'm connecting with folks. I was real worried about that prior to starting more of online therapy with folks, but doing these little rituals, dancing a little bit before I see a client, lighting my sage, saying my prayers, has really been helpful, really helpful lately.
Great. So I know that you are very involved with the BAAITS Powwow that happens here in San Francisco. I wonder if you can share with the folks a little bit more about that and how it's going to be a little bit different this coming year.
Yeah, so I have been a member of the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits, also known as BAAITS, since I moved to the Bay Area about 9 years ago, almost 8.5, 9 years ago. And I immediately joined the powwow committee and started off sort of doing marketing for them, kind of doing some social media stuff, which I'm not the best at, but that was my role. And eventually started to take more and more upfront leadership roles within the powwow. And oftentimes I was the person that would be at the information booth because folks would come and be like, what's Two-Spirit? So then I'm there to kind of give them the spiel, similar to what I gave you all just a moment ago, and then talk a little bit more about the organization. And then last year, I had the extreme pleasure of serving as the powwow chair. And it was exhilarating, scary. I never want to do that again. I can't wait to do that again. All of those things all at once. Just, we get about 5,000 people at that powwow over the past few years. So to be a part of, organizing somewhat in each area, making sure everything was running smoothly, while writing my dissertation, while teaching, while running to practice was like, what just happened? What is 2020 doing? Because the powwow this year was in February. So it was like this super, super intense lead up to that, and maybe like a couple week break. And then COVID happened. So we had to re-strategize because we would have been getting together starting next month to start planning the next powwow. Well, the challenge that we've had as an organization for many, many years is money. That powwow is so expensive to run, and we are an all-volunteer organization that struggles with getting money. A lot of Native organizations struggle with getting money. And so we decided this year to do a virtual powwow. There was something that started on Facebook shortly after we all were put in shelter in place called the social distance powwow. And it was really successful. And it was like this big thing on Facebook. And so we were really inspired by that. And so we want to do our own virtual powwow. No idea what that means. So if anybody knows anything about these things or has really good tech ideas, please reach out to me. Let me know. I could use all the help that we could use because none of us in BAAITS are real tech folk. We work in areas that largely are community-based. And even as a therapist, I consider myself, a community-based worker. So we're not really tech-minded. So if anybody listening has ideas, please get in touch.
Great. Yeah. So for anyone who hasn't been before, it's a lot of fun. I've been multiple times here to just go and soak in the culture and really honor and respect, queer folks who are part of this larger queer family that I, was not aware of these practices and traditions and really, see what's happening in other communities. So, yeah. So I'm excited to see what you end up coming up with.
Too, I think what I'm really excited about is that, the powwow, as I mentioned, gets about 5,000 folks a year. And, we get Two-Spirit folk from all over Turtle Island, what we now call North America. And I know that by doing a virtual powwow, we'll even make this more accessible. The BAAITS Two-Spirit Powwow is considered the first public Two-Spirit powwow. And it is also currently the largest public Two-Spirit powwow in the entire world, as far as we know. And so we're hoping that by doing something virtually, we're going to be able to open it up to even more folks. And then I put on like my little academic hat and I think, this stuff is the great thing about doing something virtual is that then we'll have like history of it. Then there will be like something that we can go back to. And there's something about sort of archiving and telling our own story and our own history that I think is so important with the powwow. And I absolutely know that more of my work will be around the powwow. I actually have a chapter in a book coming out. I don't know when. I'll let you know. It was originally supposed to come out this fall, but due to everything, publishing's all messed up. But my chapter is all about the Two-Spirit powwow and love, the community love I was speaking of earlier. So I kind of jumped ahead of my dissertation and wrote this chapter for this book that you're right, Nick. I think when folks go to the BAAITS powwow, there is this sense of community, of love, of learning, of unlearning. And then like the largest thing is the hope that people walk out of there with, that there's something better for all of us, that we really can come together as a community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I know for me, it really helps me not only see the face of the Two-Spirit community, but just all the other indigenous communities, because normally, especially, living here in San Francisco, but I imagine in most parts of the country, the indigenous communities have become invisible or sort of separate. And so people are not really we know they exist, but we don't have a connection with that. And so then because you have all these people coming together from all over, it's like, oh, wow, like here are these people that I've been hearing about. And, it's just great to be able to connect them with, that idea.
Yes, Native culture is alive and, as I mentioned earlier, thriving still. And I think, what we're seeing so much about the unrest in our country that we've been experiencing lately, my hope is that there's a way in which the indigenous voice can also be elevated during this time, because it is often, the majority of the learning that's really excelled my thought has come from indigenous scholars, indigenous activists, authors, but also Black scholars, Black activists. It's a big part of my understanding in the world. And my hope is that there will be space where indigenous folks will be invited to a permanent seat at that table, because oftentimes we kind of float in and out. And I'm really hoping, in particular, in our queer communities, that Two-Spirit people are invited for a permanent seat at that table, like SF Pride, hello, or other organizations like that, Not to say that SF Pride hasn't had Two-Spirit folk, but you might want to cut that part out, Nick. I've got a little with them around land acknowledgements and the parade and stuff, but that's something for something else. But I do mean that, there's something to that about, can we make space for Two-Spirit folk in queer spaces without feeling that we are being as tokenized or that we're there to fill a spot, but really because queer folk understand that without us, Two-Spirit folks, the queer family isn't complete, right? And that's really what my hope is, even if all of my work, that provides some space for someone to have a seat at that table.
Well, thank you for making more space to help us complete the queer family.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and for taking the time. Appreciate that.
So, Roger, where can people find you to learn more about your work?
Sure. My website is rogerjkuhn.com, rogerjkuhn.com. That's my therapy website. I'm in the process of redesigning that. That's one of my goals this summer. I'm spending some time with myself designing my new website because I'm trying to rebrand. I'm having this thought lately around, because I work as a professor now and a therapist, and I do public speaking, and I'm a published author. It's like, maybe I should rebrand my website. So please go there, rogerjkuhn.com, but don't go till the end of August. Hopefully I'll have it all fixed up by then with more information about my publishing, the music that I do, and also my therapy and academic offerings.
Great. And I'll also have the link in the show notes so people can find it there too. I work with many queer folks who struggle to get their needs met or who suffer from having their boundaries violated by others. Because you may not have been cared for the best, you might have a hard time identifying your needs. Or because you have been violated or bullied, you might not completely understand where exactly your boundaries are. If you'd like some help exploring your needs and building more resilient boundaries, head over to my website and download the free guide, Needs, Boundaries, and Self-Care Support for Queer Folks. This is a short introduction to help you start to shift and change your relationship to yourself and others, and to feel more safe and resourced day to day. So just head over to queerhealingjourneys.com/needs to download your free guide today. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.